Oh, holy God, for your Spirit, for breathing into us, for giving us life, for affirming who we are, for encouraging us to lend our gift of acceptance. Help us to have the courage to hear what you might have us hear this morning, and to give us the grace that we need to heal from whatever wounds that we bring with us today, and equip us so that we can actually move into the world as if we were filled with your radical love for us and for all people. In the name and in the Spirit of Jesus we pray and say together, Amen. So, amen. So we are celebrating Black History Month. It's the month of February, and I hope that you're beginning to recognize some of the faces. I keep shifting the picture on you, but I'm guessing you could name some of those folks up there. And one of the things we've been doing during Black History Month is using Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow in the World of Colorblindness. Mass incarceration. So here's a face that I didn't know until I was 26 years old. Anybody know who it is? Oh, very good. Very good. It wasn't until I was in seminary in New York City walking around and noticed that there was this Frederick Douglass Highway. Frederick Douglass was an incredible orator and teacher and writer and abolitionist. And he lived from 1818 to 1895. And he at one point said, "A heavy, cruel hand has been laid upon us. As people, we feel ourselves to be not only deeply injured, but grossly misunderstood. The great mass of American citizens estimates us as being a characterless and purposeless people. And hence we hold up our heads, if at all, against the withering influence of a nation's scorn and contempt." And while that was said in 1885, it does give us pause during this Black History Month as we take the courage to step into the issue of mass incarceration. The new N-word is criminal. And as I've said in previous sermons leading up to this, that there has been a shift in African-American treatment of African-Americans in this country, starting out with exploitation and slavery, and then subordination through Jim Crow, and then marginalization through this mass incarceration because of the way the system around particularly minor drug offenses are, the criminal justice system targets inner city youth, primarily men. So when we say that someone's treated like a criminal, we believe and know that that means they're less than human. And as I spent time last week, I don't want to rehearse everything because it was a long sermon, but there are some contributing factors to this, beginning with the way in which there's innocence around plea bargaining and not good legal representation. So oftentimes people agree to become felons not knowing what the implications will be for the rest of their lives because they think they're doing the right thing to take a lesser sentence. But even once they've been sentenced and spend even 6 months or a year in jail, you carry that label felon with you for a lifetime. And of course there are collateral consequences. You lose all public assistance by way of housing, trouble with employment. If you've not filled out a job application recently, there are some that have a box that say, please check if you are a felon or if you have any criminal charges against you. And you can imagine if an employer is trying to figure out ways to screen, if that box is checked, it's a pretty easy one to put in the recycling bin. Can't vote, no jury service. There are debts and fees set up so that oftentimes you may be in prison and you may be working for like $3 or $4 an hour, and you make enough money to sort of take care of the basic needs, but you can't really just write out a check for maybe your fee is $800. You don't have $800, so you keep getting getting stuck because you can never make enough to pay the fee. And one of the things that's most challenging about the new Jim Crow as opposed to the old Jim Crow. Remember old Jim Crow? It was so clear, the signs were colored and white. Everything was overtly racist, and it was ugly for all of us. We could see it, it was out in the open, and because of that, the African American community remained strong in support of one another because they could rally around this really egregious and clear kind of racism. Mass incarceration and the whole issue around drugs and the way in which it's affected primarily inner cities has made it virtually impossible for the black community to come to some consensus. And so they, in some ways, have bought into the stigma that maybe we really are as bad as the culture tells us to be. So the black community can be split. There can be those who are advocating for tougher and tougher laws because, quite frankly, there is violence in the inner cities. And so if their choice is between more violence or more prison, and those are kind of the options, you're probably going to vote for prison, but not a particularly good choice. And of course, silence is a real challenge within the African American community because nobody really wants to admit that maybe their son or daughter or uncle, nephew has gone to prison. So nobody really talks about it so much. So it's hard to get together and actually do something to make some changes in the way the system works. The reaction of severely stigmatized people. This was something that was made back around the civil rights time. Black is beautiful. Some of you might remember in the 60s and 70s there was a black power movement, and there'd be the fist raised, and it was black is beautiful, and so there was kind of a militant edge to it. But the reality is it was a way of trying to integrate, capture, and overcome this negative stigma and turn it into something positive. Some of us might be able to identify with the way in which the stigma of being gay has been turned around into gay pride. And so there's a way in which if you've been stigmatized, you want to find a way to make, in some ways, friends with and turn around the stigma. Here was one of my personal favorites. And we could laugh about that, but I was thinking of other stigmas that we might be able to think about. So when you reclaim a stigma, it's a statement of resistance, both individually and politically. But, you know, I was thinking about the other stigmas that, you know, it's too easy to just say, well, I'm not black, or I'm not this, or I'm not that. How many of you have felt the stigma of being fat? I got teased about it as a little boy. In fact, I had to wear chubbies and huskies, and that was about one of the most humiliating things. I had people call me Little Orphan Annie because I had curly red hair and I was chubby and I looked like Little Orphan Annie. So there's a way in which stigma lives with all of us. I was really trying to find, the reason I didn't put obesity or fat up there is I couldn't find some way in which that has actually been reclaimed as a stigma. I Googled fat is beautiful and I did not find anything that you would want to see up on the screen. And so there's a way in which we get this reality of stigma. We get it. Which is one of the reasons why it's a challenge to understand black culture, because some of us are used to seeing this kind of image. And I didn't know this until I read Michelle's book, but the droopy pants, you know, my gut reaction is haul up your pants. But you know why they're like that? Because that's the way jail clothes are worn. And so there's this huge challenge in the culture of black kids. And there was a story, and I just realized I left Michelle Alexander's book in my office. But I was going to read you a story about Ronnie, but I can basically tell you what Ronnie's story is. 16-year-old kid, and he said his grandma asks him every day, when do you think you're going to get arrested again? Because he's already been to juvie. And he said the police follow him everywhere, and the teachers are always threatening to call the police. He's called an F up by everybody that he sees in power or authority. So he says, because everybody acts like I'm going to be a criminal, I'm going to do the best job I can of showing them that I'm not going to take their, and I'm going to be this way, and so there's an embracing of the culture of violence that from our perspective makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And quite frankly, it is self-defeating and completely unhealthy for these young black teens to embrace the culture of violence. But could it be that it's a little bit like the new minstrel show? Because the reality is, those who are involved in gangster rap make millions of dollars. So in some ways, it's this measure of success, even though it's sick and it's unhealthy, and it continues the cycle of incarceration. But I lift this up for you simply because if you have been stigmatized by anything, you know how difficult it is to overcome that stigma. And so in some ways, these young kids have no other choice, although we'd like to think that they do. And a few of them do. So the antidote, Michelle Alexander says, is to name the paradox, that we are products of our environment, so we can't just ignore that, and yet we also have a capacity for transcendence. That is, we do have a moral compass. We can make some choices about what we do, so it's not all one thing or the other. But it's very difficult to break the cycle of condemnation and contempt for those who are trapped in the system. So Michelle says, separate out the crime from the criminal. Sounds a little bit like separating out sin from the sinner. But you know, there are some obstacles to the antidote. Remember I told you that it's not a political or a party issue around mass incarceration, that there have been movements from whoever was in power, Democrats or Republicans. This mass incarceration and get tough on crime has been a theme that started in 1980. And have you noticed that we don't hear that, I mean, for 10 or 15 years, if you're old enough to remember, the war on drugs, crack cocaine, how evil that is, that was the main theme. And have you noticed that you don't hear very much about crack cocaine anymore? What do we hear a lot about in the media? Terrorism, right? Terrorism is the new war on drugs. We have this incredible capacity to focus and project our hatred and our fear on groups of people. So now there are lots of Muslims living in our community who are terrified because there are people in the world, in our community, who think that if you are Muslim, you are a terrorist. Wrong. But this was not yet President Obama. This was President Obama in his hometown of Chicago before he was elected, speaking at I can't remember, Apostolic Good News Church of Chicago. It's an independent church, big, huge church, and he gave a speech. And in that speech, he said there are too many fathers who are missing. They're MIA, they're AWOL, and they're acting like boys instead of men. In other words, the image I just had up there about gangster rap, he was saying basically, it's your fault. You've got to start acting like men. Now that's a message that sells to part of the African American community, and it sells to most of the white. I remember thinking, wow, you know what? He's not going to just let I remember at the time thinking he's not going to let these thugs get away with things. That's an oversimplification. So his question around where have all the black men gone, nobody said anything about prison. That's where they are. And it's not all about violent crime. 70% of the men who are incarcerated and are African American are there for D felonies, which is the lowest sentence you could get. And it's for crack cocaine, and if there were white boys in the suburbs that had the same kind of rules about powder cocaine or marijuana, our prisons would be full of white teenagers. So there's a real complexity of denial for all of us about this issue. We know and we don't know about mass incarceration. Now, I'll talk for myself. Before I read this book, I did know that there was a real issue with African American populations in urban centers being jailed for drug offenses. But I had swallowed the myth and thought that these were evil, terrible people who, were just despicable, and, they were throwaways, quite frankly. This is confession. I mean, I really believe that why should we bother? Why should we bother? Chronic problems, we can't do anything about it. Why should we even let ourselves get discouraged or disturbed by it? Because we can't do anything about it. It's in their culture. Anybody with me on that? You want to confess? Confessions? And we still have a profound misunderstanding regarding how racial oppression works. And as I said earlier, when we think about the civil rights, and we think about seeing KKK, and those of you who remember George Wallace blocking the schools when they were trying to be segregated, we can go, oh, that's awful, it's disgusting, because it's right out there, and you could see it. Now, mass incarceration is kind of out of sight, out of mind. It's happening to somebody, but, they get what they deserve, right? You see those pictures of that gangster rap, carrying guns around, valorizing violence. They ought to get thrown in jail. If it were that simple. Structural racism. Michelle Alexander does a lovely job of using the image or metaphor of a birdcage. Now think for a minute if we could deconstruct this birdcage. Just imagine it sort of unfolding. And if you took it apart and you had these pieces, there'd be little slats of metal, and there'd be a piece of wood. And so if it were taken apart, there would be nothing that suggests there's anything racist about our criminal justice system. It's only when all of the things start fitting together by way of the way police have discretion about arrests, to the way that the laws have been written intentionally to target primarily black or brown-skinned people, you can begin to see that depending on which side of the cage you're in, it would look very different. And here's the thing that's the most tricky about our understanding of mass incarceration, is that you'll notice that this bird cage, like all big bird cages, has a feature on it that's swung open. The door, right? So if we were really good, we'd be able to just go out the door. There must be some voluntariness about being in this cage. So the current system invites us to imagine that those who are trapped in the system were free to avoid second-class status or permanent banishment from society by choosing not to commit crimes. Well, in Mr. Obama's own home state, 90% of those sentenced to prison in Illinois for drug offense are African American. White offenders minors are rarely arrested. They usually receive misdemeanors and avoid jail time. 55% of adult black men are felons. It's in the city of Chicago. 80% adult black male workforce are felons. 70% of all criminal cases involving Class D felony drug possession charges, African American. Mass incarceration in our minds has become normal and natural. Choice or birdcage? To make this point clear, how many of you remember that in, well, wait a minute. I'm talking now about the decade of 1980 to 1990. That was when the war on drugs started. There was something else happening at the time, but the war on drugs was an effort to shift the racism in a colorblind way so that we weren't talking about keeping blacks in control or in second-class status. We were talking about criminals, and then we defined how you get to be a criminal, and it was much easier if you were black. That's a quick summary of the book. And look at the money, $1 trillion spent from 1980 to 1990. And how many of you remember Mothers Against Drunk Driving? Happened in the same decade. The war on drugs was a very intentional, political, legal, media. It was definitely top down. We were told that this was a real problem, and we needed to do something about it, and we're going to do something about it. We're going to get tough on crime. We're going to put those suckers away that need to get put away. But there was a grassroots problem about drunk drivers. People were getting killed. Mothers got mad. They decided to do something about it. So here, 1980 to 1990, drunk driving, there were 22,000 deaths. And alcohol-related deaths were 100,000 in the decade. Now, alcohol-related might mean everything that I drank too much and I fell down the stairs and broke my neck. To any other alcohol-related, I died of cirrhosis of the liver that was alcohol-related. So notice that drug-related deaths were 21,000, and that included HIV, overdose, and death from violence. So 1,000 less than drunk driving. And here's how the sentencing worked. Drunk drivers, when they were sentenced, they were given 1 to 2 days in jail. And for the second offense, they would get 5 to 10 days in jail, their license revoked, and they would have to do community service. In other words, there was an assumption that if you put prevention and community service in ways to curb a person's behavior, there is some hope that you could actually help them stay in mainstream society. You may or may not remember from last week that the difference in the sentencing is that if you were caught with a tiny bit of crack cocaine or a tiny bit of marijuana, you could be thrown in prison for 1 to 5 years. Again, remember, it's which drug is it that we think is so awful and terrible? We've kind of accepted alcohol, even though we know how detrimental it can be to health, public health issue. So isn't it interesting, too, that 78% of drunk driving convictions were white men? So the war on drugs versus MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, reveals kind of national priorities and approaches. Compassion and support would, if we wanted to do a war on poverty, prevention and treatment versus shame and contempt. And here's what I like about Michelle's point. She says, you know what? We all fall short, we all make mistakes, and we all break the law. So I have 2 sons, as you know. One of them's been through college, and it was not uncommon for him to report that there was cocaine and there was liquor and all kinds of things, underage drinking, because it was happening at a privileged white college. Did any of those kids get thrown in jail? No, they didn't. Somebody could be selling marijuana from the comfort of their college dorm room to make money for spring break. But the kid who's standing on the corner on the south side of Chicago who's trying to help his mother stay in her public housing gets busted, and he spends 1 to 5 years in prison. Is there something wrong with the picture, sisters and brothers? Here's the other interesting thing. Statistically, probably more people die from car crashes than die from illegal drug use. So chances are, if you have driven 10 to 15 miles an hour over the speed limit, you've probably done more to risk public safety than the kid who smoked a joint. Now that's going to, some of you are going to be looking, did he just say that? I'm trying to get you to think about what are the core values that you hold, and what is it that's really important, and who is it that matters? We all carry around those individual judgment, what's really awful, what's terrible. You start scratching away at it a little bit, and what you find is something pretty ugly. So, in some ways, inner city, black, primarily youth, who have found gangs, because it's kind of their only way to find connection, because their fathers are in jail, they've become the untouchables. You know, when you hear a Bible section of Scripture read, and we've probably heard lepers so many times that we know it was some kind of illness, and it was kind of gross, and it caused huge colonies, separation because it was contagious. This is what leprosy looks like. I mean, it's gruesome. And I put this picture up here only so you would know just how profound it was that Jesus even saw somebody who had leprosy, let alone listened, let alone chose to heal them. And notice how Jesus did the healing. When he saw them, he said, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were made clean. This is not one of those stories where Jesus puts some mud on his hands and goes up and puts his hand on them. No, he says, go show yourselves to the priest. In other words, the priest is the one that will connect you with your community. If you want to be healed, you're going to go in the direction of being part of the community again, and you're not going to be an isolated person, the pariah. And as they went, they were made whole. That is the powerful story, and Jesus is calling us today to see who is the pariah. Who is it that is shoved way out of the way and not included because they are too disgusting, there's too much trouble, there's no simple solution? I would contend that African American males today are the lepers. Creative, intelligent, troubled youth is what that says. And I've put this out here. This has been, as you know, a prophetic month, Black History Month. I have not necessarily enjoyed researching this, nor have I wondered, are these people going to get sick of me telling me how bad things are and they'll ride me out on a rail? Well, I think this is the way we get to serious issues. Is that we start by seeing like Jesus did. He saw, he listened, he responded, and he took steps to bring those who had been marginalized back into the mainstream. That's what I hope that we can do. Next Sunday, most of my sermon will focus on ways in which we might be able to take some action and be a part of a solution to this incredibly difficult and complex issue. I hope you'll be there. I hope that you know that as you go out into the world during this week, the best thing you can do is to be aware of your own biases, your own judgment, the way in which you see people who are different, and you might get pulled one way or the other. I know one of the things I struggle with is now if I see a person of color, sometimes I fall all over myself to be kind and nice, And that might even seem stupid. That might seem weird. Why are you being so nice to me? I don't even know who you are. Do you get that? This is the normalizing of how we as people who are very different find bridges. And that's what Jesus did, kind of without even thinking about it. That's the presence of God in our midst, and we've been called. The people were heard to say, Amen.